What is up, guys? This is Max Square, and in this video I'm going to be showing you a beginner's guide to After Effects. Now, I've done a video like this in the past called an introduction to After Effects, but that was a few years ago, so it's a little outdated, so I thought I'd update that video for you guys. So in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to make this animation. We'll go ahead and take a look. So it's pretty simple, nothing too fancy going on here, but I think a lot of the techniques used in this animation will help you in projects later on. Now, one thing that would definitely help you with this entire animation is using the same audio track, since I'm going to be syncing it up to certain parts of the music. So I'll put a link down below to where I got this. It's a track from Audio Jungle. I believe it comes with 4 different versions, all of different lengths, so definitely be sure to check that out if you're interested. So this is what our project should look like toward the end of this video. We've got 2 main comps, our master comp, and then 1 composition just where we throw in our logo. So we're gonna go up to File, go over to New, and then select New Project. And then we're gonna select New Composition, and we're gonna call this Master. And I'm gonna be using 1080p 29 frames per second. And you can enter in this information manually, but if you are trying to go for a 4K composition, make sure you just change the width and the height there, because otherwise you're just gonna be working in 1080p. Now our composition is gonna be 8 seconds long, so that means we're gonna have 00, because these are our frames, then these are our seconds, minutes, and then hours. So we're just gonna put 08 in the second to right column, and then select OK. Now, if your composition is really zoomed in and you can't see anything, you can actually zoom out by just hitting Command- or Command+ to toggle that zoom. And one thing that's definitely going to help you is making sure you have all of the same windows and the same layout that I have. Now, you can enable all of these windows by going up to Window and then just checking the ones you need. You'll see I have the Align panel. This is going to let us just align text and other objects to our canvas. And then I also have our effects and presets. That's this window over here. Then I have the character and paragraph windows. Then I have the effect controls panel, so anything like a blur or a color fill is gonna appear in this panel. And then lastly, I have this Motion 2 script. Now, this is actually a paid plugin for After Effects. I would definitely recommend checking this out, but you don't need to use this in order to follow along. We'll get into exactly what it does later in this video, but that's just what this window does. So the first thing we're gonna do is just create a full solid on our canvas. Now, what you can do is just double click the rectangle tool at the top in our tools panel, and that's actually gonna create a full size rectangle to the composition. So if your composition is 1920 by 1080, it's gonna create a 1920 by 1080 rectangle. Now, we can control the fill and the stroke up here by actually clicking on the fill text. So if you click on the rectangle, you can change the color, but in order to enable the fill, you actually need to click the fill text. And this is where you can choose between transparent, solid, and then different types of gradients. So I'm just gonna go with a solid color, but I also wanna remove this stroke, so I'm gonna click on that stroke and then select transparent. So now we just have a solid white rectangle. Now, you can really choose whatever colors you want to use. I'm actually gonna be using a site called coolers.co. Basically, it's just a random color generator, and you can just hit spacebar and it'll generate new colors for you. So I really like this palette, so I'm gonna go ahead and grab this orange, select our rectangle, and then just paste it in there in this hex code. So this is the same code that I copied from that rectangle, and I'm just pasting it in here in this dialog box. I'm gonna hit OK. And then I'm just gonna select our shape and hit Command D. That's gonna duplicate that shape, and I'm gonna change it to this other blue from our palette here. So again, just copying that hex code, selecting the fill box, pasting it in. I'm gonna duplicate our rectangle one more time, and then I'm gonna select this lime color and paste it in the fill. So now we have a lime, we have a blue, and an orange shape. And now we need to start animating our rectangle. So we're gonna go to about 20 frames into our timeline. We're actually just gonna zoom in by hitting the plus icon on our keyboard. That's just gonna give us a little bit more room to work with. What we're gonna do is select the shape layer and select P on our keyboard. And that's gonna bring up our position properties, and we're gonna select this stopwatch on the left, and that's gonna create a keyframe. And then we're gonna go to the beginning of our timeline, so where it's at 0 frames per second, and then we're gonna hover over the 960 number, click, and then just drag to the left, and that's actually gonna move our shape over to the left. So I'm just gonna move it to where it's just off the canvas, and I'm actually gonna hide our other rectangles just so we can see what we're doing. And if we play it back, you'll see it just slides in from left to right. Now to make it a little bit more interesting, we're going to select these keyframes, right click, and then go down to Keyframe Assistant and select Easy Ease. This is going to give us way more control when we're animating, and you'll see why in just a second. If we select those keyframes and select this graph editor at the top right, we're going to select that, and you'll see we actually have a graph of what those keyframes are doing. So if I hit Command Z, you'll see we just have these box keyframes where it's sliding in from left to right. But if I undo that, you see it's a nice smooth arc. Now what we can actually do is select these keyframes, and you'll see we have these little yellow handles, and that's going to allow us to accelerate or decelerate the animation really smoothly. So what we can actually do is select the end of this yellow handle, and we can hold down Shift so we don't mess up where it's actually going, and then we'll just drag it over to the left. So now if we play it back, you'll see it has kind of an accelerated motion at the beginning, and then it kind of eases into it. If we want to make that a little bit more pronounced, you can go to the left keyframe and drag this in to the left as well, and that'll just make it a little bit more obvious. What you could also do is drag the left keyframe all the way to the middle so that you have really smooth ends, but just a really big motion in the middle. So if we play that back, you'll see it's a little bit more bouncy. I'm going to leave this over to the left just because I think that's the smoothest you can get it. Now, if you aren't seeing these handles on our keyframes, make sure that you go down to this list icon and that edit speed graph is checked and not edit value graph. For some reason in After Effects, it doesn't let you use the value graph for position, anchor point, and rotation properties. So if you're ever editing those kind of values, then you'll have to switch to the speed graph. Now we're just going to select those keyframes. We're going to hit Command C to copy them. And then we're going to drag our timeline over to the 0 frames so that we can paste our keyframes in the same place. And then we're just going to hit Command V to paste those, go up to Shape Layer 3 and paste that in as well. And what we're going to do is actually select all of our rectangles and select U on the keyboard. And that's going to bring up all of the animated properties. So this is a really nice way to just see what's being animated and not to see all the properties that you could animate on a particular layer. So now if we enable those other rectangles again, obviously the top layer is going to be covering everything. So to fix this, we're just going to drag the middle rectangle over a couple frames and then do the same for the top layer. Now you'll see that we get this nice kind of blended motion between all three of those rectangles. Now whatever rectangle is on top is going to be the final color, so if you want to be working on a white background, just change that top layer. So I'm actually going to go back to about 15 frames or so in our timeline to right before the rectangles are filled in. And I'm going to go up to our rectangle tool and just hold that down and select the ellipse tool. And I'm going to go onto our composition and hold down Alt and Shift and then just drag over to the right. That's actually going to create a perfect circle for us. And I'm going to change this to a white solid. Now you'll see that we have this little crosshair up to the left. Now this is actually what's called the anchor point. Now this is what the whole shape will be based around. So if I try to rotate this, you'll see it actually rotates around that point. It's not rotating from the center of the circle. So one way we can fix that is by using that script that I mentioned. You can go to the anchor point part of the plugin and just select center, and that'll fix that for you. But if you don't have the plugin, you can actually just go down to the transform properties and move it around until you get it where you want. I just use this plugin because it centers it perfectly for you, and I'm pretty sure that there are free plugins that will do just that for you. I'll probably link one down in the description. Then we're just going to make sure that that is perfectly aligned to our composition. One thing that'll save you time when you're animating is actually just starting where you want it to end. That might sound kind of obvious, but if we know we want this circle to be this size, then we'll actually just set keyframes for it right where we are and then go back in time and animate it rather than setting a keyframe, scaling it down, and then trying to go and set another keyframe to where we had it a few seconds ago. So I'm going to go into about 20 frames, maybe 25 frames, and hit S on our keyboard, and that's going to bring up our scale properties. And now I'm going to go back to about 15 frames, maybe about 10 frames, and I'm going to set this scale to 0%. Now I'm going to hit U on our keyboard so we can see those properties. I'm going to right click, go to Keyframe Assistant, and set it to Easy Ease. And now we're going to jump into our graph editor, and we're going to make this a really poppy animation by dragging all the handles to the middle. So if we watch this back from the beginning, you see that we have our rectangles come in and then we have this nice popping circle. So it's looking pretty cool. Now we're gonna add our accents around the circle. So I'm actually gonna show you 2 ways to do this. The fastest way is to use the plugin because it actually has a built-in burst mode. So if I were to just click that, you'll see it actually creates those little explosion tick marks there for us, and we can just add as many copies as we want. We can change the color to whatever we want. It's really easy to control it this way, but I'm gonna show you how to do this manually just really quick in case you don't have the plugin. So I've created a new composition just to show you how to do this. You don't have to do the same thing, but I'm gonna go up to our shape tools and select the rectangle tool, and I'm just gonna draw a really small little line there. You might wanna zoom in. So we have our line there, and I actually wanna round out the end, so I'm gonna go to the rectangle path and go to roundness and just drag that to about 100 or so, and now you'll see we have a nice rounded rectangle. And what we're gonna do is go over to where it says add. We're gonna click that arrow and select repeater. Now, as the name suggests, this is just gonna repeat whatever you have in your shape layer. So we have this line, it's just gonna create multiple copies of that for us. So we can just drag this out as many as we want, but this is going in a horizontal line and we want it to go in a circle. So to fix that, we're gonna drop down the transform repeater properties, and we're gonna set the position to 0, 0. That's just gonna stack them all on top of each other. And then we're gonna go to rotation and we're gonna select 360 because that's a circle, and we're gonna divide it by the number of copies that we have. So because we have 6 copies, we're gonna type /6 and hit enter, and you'll see that that has rotated them. And now to actually make it into a circle, we're gonna go up to the transform rectangle and move this anchor point. We're gonna select the second option and we're just gonna drag out to the right, and you'll see that I'll actually separate them out into a circle array. Now, if you wanna add any more of these lines, just go over to the copies and you can change it to something like 15, and then make sure you go down to the rotation, select that number again, type in 360, and then just divide it by however many copies you have. But I'm gonna jump back to using our plugin just because it's gonna be a little bit easier to work with. So first of all, I'm gonna turn off the stroke effect since I don't really want that look, and I'm gonna change the fill to white. I'm gonna change the number of copies to 15, and I'm gonna change the width to 13 and the height to 20. So that just gives us this nice little dot looking effect. And then we're gonna drag our timeline over to about 25 frames or so. And we're gonna set keyframes for the burst height, the burst width, and then we're gonna set one for the distance from center, burst offset, and the number of copies. Now, if we hit U on our keyboard, you'll see we have those 5 keyframes, and I'm gonna scroll back to where our circle in the middle is just animating on. So that's about 15 or 16 frames. What I'm gonna do is set the width and the height to 0. I'm gonna set the distance from center to 0. I'm gonna set the burst offset to something like 180 or so. That's gonna give us a really nice random jumbled effect at the beginning, and I'm gonna set number of copies to 0. Now we're gonna animate each keyframe differently, but we can start off by selecting them all and just changing them to easy ease. For some properties in After Effects, like the number of copies and opacity, you won't actually notice a huge difference from when you're just using linear keyframes and when you actually switch to easy ease, but since we've changed it, we'll just go from here. So first, we're gonna set the number of copies to be a really short keyframe. We're just gonna have them really close together. And then we're actually going to reverse the width and the height. So we actually want it to start at the height and width we want and then just scale down to 0. So what we're gonna do is select the keyframes on the left and drag them all the way over to the right past the end keyframes. And then we can select all of those and drag them over to the left so it's offset a bit from the rest of the animation. And now if we play that whole thing back, you'll see we have this nice kind of explosion effect going on here. Now you can tweak any of these settings as much as you want. You can select all the end keyframes, drag them out to the right so it's a longer animation. You can adjust the width and the height as needed, but that's pretty much the look we're going for. Now before we move on, let's just rename some of these layers so we can stay organized. We can rename one by either right-clicking and selecting rename, or we can just hit enter and type in a name. So I'm gonna call this background 1. Select that, hit enter, background 2, background 3, and I'm gonna select this and call this center circle, and burst will be center explosion. Now we actually want the center circle to be at the top of our layers, and you'll see why later on in the video, but just make sure you have it in this arrangement. Now we need to work on those side explosions that are going on in the background. So what I'm gonna do is just duplicate the center explosion about 4 times. We just hit Command D 4 times, and I'm gonna call this side explosion 1. I'm actually just gonna copy that name and paste it in and change that to 2, 3, and 4. Now all of these are stacked right on top of each other. So what I'm gonna do is hit side explosion and then go up to our effect controls and move the global position over. And I'm just gonna move this up to the top left corner. And instead of messing around with the distance from the center, I'm actually just gonna scale down this whole layer down to something like 35%. So it's just a really small effect going on there. Then I'm actually gonna do the same thing for the side explosion 2, just move that over to the right this time, move it up to the top. And we're gonna change this scale to 20%. And side explosion 3 will move over to the right and set that scale to 35%. And then for side explosion 3, we're gonna set this to 20% and move it over to the left and down. Now, if we play that back, you'll actually just see it all kind of just happens at once. So it's really fast, it's kind of hard to see. We really want this to sync up with the music, which at this point we can go ahead and add in our music. This is what it'll look like if you download the same pack. You get 4 different versions. They're all different lengths, and I'm actually just gonna use the 4th version because it's the shortest track. I'm just gonna drag that into our comp and then drag it down to the bottom of our layers. Now what I'm gonna do is hold down Command and select this arrow key, and that'll reveal the actual waveform so that we can sync up with all the major hits and sound effects in the track. So we want some of these explosions to sync up where you see these big hits. You can kind of see them in the waveform. They're kind of these cliffs. So if we go over to the first one over here, we'll just drag side explosion so that it starts at the beginning of that one, and we'll have side explosion 3 sync up with that one, and then side explosion 2 and 4 will go over to the next hit over here. So if we play everything back right now, we have some explosions going on the side, but it is happening a little quickly. So what I'm gonna do is select all those side explosions and hit U on the keyboard. And now we can see everything that's going on for all of those keyframes. So I'm actually gonna just drag some of these end keyframes over to the right, so everything's just a little bit longer. Now, if you wanted to make everything the same length, you could start them all at the same position in the timeline and then set your cursor to wherever you want it and drag the end keyframes there. But I kind of like the random effect that this has, so that's why I'm doing that. And now if we play everything back, you'll see that animating the side. One thing to keep in mind is that I do have a pretty bright kind of neon color background, so everything is just very high contrast. Right now it's kind of hard to see those whites in the background. So if you are struggling to see that, you can always just change the background by going to the fill and then just getting something a little bit more neutral, or just dialing back whatever color you have. So by changing that, you can actually see those explosions just a little bit better. So to do this, I'm actually just gonna duplicate our center circle by hitting Command D, and I'm gonna drag that under the original center circle and just rename this to Outline 1. And then I'm gonna select that outline and delete that fill. So we're gonna change it to transparent, and I'm gonna add a white stroke. Now we're gonna hit U on the keyboard, and we're actually just gonna delete those scale keyframes, and we're gonna scale this up to the size we want. So that looks pretty good there. And now we're gonna drop down that arrow, go to Add, and we're gonna select Trim Paths. Now we're gonna select a keyframe for the start property, go back in time just a little bit, and change this to 100%. So if we play that back, you'll see it animates on. Now if you wanted to go the other way, you could just delete those properties and do the same thing for the end. So set one for the end property, go to the beginning, and set this to 0, and then you'll see it now goes counterclockwise. Now we're gonna select those keyframes and go to Easy Ease, jump into our graph editor, and we're gonna drag those handles all the way to the middle. So if we play that back, we have a really nice snapping effect. Now I'm gonna duplicate that outline, and you'll see it's already renamed it to Outline 2. After Effects is pretty smart that way. and I'm going to change the stroke to something really thin like 5, and then go to our scale properties and scale this up so it's the outer circle. Of course, you can change any of the strokes and the scaling effects as you want. This is just what I think looks good. Now we have just a couple more steps. What we're going to do is animate that center circle to pop up at the beginning. So what I'm going to do is hit U on our top layer, and I'm going to select a keyframe all the way at the left. And what this is going to do is just set a keyframe for whatever property you're at right now. So because the last keyframe for this property was 100%, if we set another one, it's just going to leave that at 100%. So this is kind of adding a freeze frame effect for the few frames we have between these two keyframes. And now what I'm going to do is actually scale this to something like 95%, maybe actually 85. Then I'm going to jump over just a few frames, and I'm going to scale this all the way to where it fills the entire composition. So for me, that's about 600%. And if we just watch that back, and if we want to keep tweaking this, we can actually select just these 3 keyframes and jump into our graph editor. And we're going to make this a really snappy animation. Actually just drag the right handle all the way over. So if we play this back now, we have this nice kind of explosion effect. And now we're just going to create our logo composition. So we're going to jump to composition, select new composition, and change this to logo, hit OK. And then we can just drag in our logo. I've just dragged in the Max Square logo here. One thing that will really keep everything clean and minimal is by setting this to a small size. I have really large logo files, so that for me just means setting it to 15%. If I set it to 100, it'll look something like this, just because it's a really high quality graphic. So I've just scaled that down to that size. Now obviously I've put a white logo on a white background so you can't see anything. This is actually intentional, but if you want to retain whatever brand color you have, just make sure you use a background color that lets you see it. But if you're not worried about that, let's jump over into effects and presets and type in fill. We're going to drag under the generate folder, just drag that over to logo. And I'm going to jump back to our original colors and just grab this dark purple and change the color there. Now what I'm going to do is hit R and then hold down shift and hit P, and that's going to let us see position and rotation properties. I'm going to set keyframes for both of those and just drag them over. And first I'm going to move the rotation to something like -15. And then I want this to come up from the bottom of the screen, so I'm going to animate it down by just dragging up the y-axis, so something around 1300 looks good. And then I want this to kind of go a little too far before it settles into what we've set our end keyframes to be. So I'm going to drag those end keyframes over just a little bit more, and then right before we get there, I'm going to have this animate just a little bit up above where we want it to settle in. So obviously that's not perfectly centered, but then it should just settle in like that. I'm going to set all these to easy ease, and then just have a nice popping animation there. So if we watch it back, so it doesn't look too great. That's just because it's slow. There's a few ways we can fix that. First, we can drag the end keyframes in a little bit, but we can also select all those keyframes and then drag the left handles all the way to the middle, just so it's a little bit quicker. So if we watch that back, it's a little bit more snappy. Now you kind of just have to tweak this for whatever animation you're doing, but to get that nice little snapping effect will really look good depending on the music. So now the final step is just to sync everything up with the music. Now just before we get started on this part, keep in mind that I've just shown you how to animate everything first, and I haven't been listening to the music. So everything might be a little staggered and kind of off time. So we're probably gonna have to end up moving some of these keyframes around. So let's check this out. So, alright, so it's not too bad. The logo is actually pretty close in time, but the main center circle animates up too quickly. So I'm going to drop down these keyframes here and just drag this over to where it fades up, where we have that big impact here. And I might actually just make it a little bit longer. Just keep dragging it over. Might go back a bit. This is really just trial and error until you think whatever looks good. I might have the logo start a little bit sooner, but instead of moving those keyframes over, I'm actually just going to drag the whole composition over. So that's looking pretty good at the end. Now, those center circles are animating just a little quickly. So I'm gonna move these beginning properties for the center circle over a bit. Go to the center explosion and make this just a bit quicker, but also just stagger this over a bit. Let's check this out. Now our outlines are kind of covering everything, so we're gonna just drag those over. And I also want these to fill up right before the circle animates up. So right before it dips down, I want it to just be completing everything in the circle. So that's looking pretty good. Let's try this. Now lastly, these side explosions aren't really timed up with the music. Now the reason for this is actually because our keyframes don't start where we start our layers. So to fix this, I'm actually just gonna drag all the keyframes over to the start of each of these layers. Let's watch it one more time. So that is looking pretty close to the demo I showed you at the beginning of this video. Now we just have to export it out of After Effects. So we're gonna go up to File, select Export, and add to Render Queue. And if you want to change any of the settings, you can select Lossless, and this will give you a box where you can enter in all of the custom settings that you need. You can jump into Format Options and actually change the codec. You can change this to Apple ProRes if you know what you're doing. If not, just leave it to Animation, select OK, and then hit OK again. Select Output to and change where you want to export it to. Just hit Demo, and then just hit Render. So guys, that is it for the beginner's guide to After Effects. I hope that helped anyone new to After Effects or just getting started with animation. If you had any problems following along, be sure to drop a comment down below, and also check out the project file that I used to create this animation, which I will link down in the description. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more Mac videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.